Texas, 1945. The wind carried dust across the rails as a train squealed to a stop under a sun that burned white. Doors slammed open, and out stepped women in torn gray uniforms, German insignia still on their sleeves, faces pale from months of captivity. They looked around in disbelief. This wasn't Europe. It smelled of oil, mesquite, and freedom they no longer understood. An American sergeant barked orders, but his tone was calm, almost polite. The women exchanged frightened glances. Back home, they'd been told Americans were monsters who hated Germans, who would make them pay for every bomb and bullet. Then a young private handed each of them a towel and a bar of soap. "Showers are down the hall, ma'am," he said. "Ma'am." Steam drifted from the open doorway. The scent of soap, real soap, filled the air. For months, that smell had meant fear. In the camps of Europe, it meant death. They froze. But the sergeant only nodded. "Go on," he said quietly. "It's warm." One by one, they stepped inside. Water fell, real water, washing away mud, salt, and terror. For the first time in years, no one shouted. No one pointed a gun. And as the steam rose, so did a truth none of them were ready for. Sometimes the greatest shock in war isn't cruelty. It's kindness. Europe, spring 1945. The Reich was collapsing. Across bomb-scarred cities and burned villages, German units surrendered by the tens of thousands. Among them were hundreds of women, clerks, nurses, radio operators, and auxiliary staff, the invisible backbone of a dying army. They were exhausted, hungry, and convinced that capture meant humiliation or execution. Nazi propaganda had seen to that. Posters and broadcasts warned that Allied soldiers would torture female captives, shave their heads, even kill them. So when American MPs ordered them to assemble, rifles slung but muzzles lowered, most expected the end. Instead, the prisoners were handed rations, tinned meat, bread, chocolate. "Eat," said an interpreter. "You're safe now." Safe. It was a word none of them believed. Days later, they learned the unimaginable. They were being sent not to camps in Europe, but across the ocean. To America. The journey felt surreal. The war had shrunk their world to rubble and fear. Now it suddenly expanded beyond comprehension. On the docks of Le Havre and Southampton, hundreds of German POWs, men and women alike, were loaded onto Liberty ships. They crossed the Atlantic under heavy guard, but the guards were almost friendly. Some Americans shared cigarettes. Others asked questions in halting German. "Why did you fight for him?" "For Hitler." Most prisoners stayed silent, staring at the horizon, wondering if this voyage was exile or punishment. When the convoy reached the Gulf of Mexico, sunlight cut across endless blue. The prisoners pressed against the rails. America wasn't ruins. It was wide, bright, impossibly alive. Trains waited in New Orleans and Houston to carry them inland, to places with names they'd never heard. Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, Fort Oglethorpe. The first thing they noticed was the space. No barbed wire walls stretching to the horizon. No guard towers every 50 meters. Instead, wooden fences, neat rows of barracks, and smiles. Local farmers waved as the trucks passed. Children pointed and laughed. Not in hatred but curiosity. "Is this captivity?" one woman whispered. At Fort Oglethorpe, they were processed, photographed, and issued clean uniforms marked PW. No beatings, no insults, just paperwork and food, plenty of food. They were given beds with blankets, not straw. Coffee, eggs, fruit. One woman wept silently over a slice of orange, something she hadn't tasted in years. For many, the shock was harder than any cruelty could have been. Everything they'd been told about the enemy was unraveling. The camp commander addressed them on the first evening. "You are prisoners of war," he said. "You will work, you will follow our rules, and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." He paused. "How you behave will determine how soon you go home." It was firm but fair, and fairness was something these women no longer recognized. Days turned to weeks. American soldiers remained distant but respectful. Some prisoners volunteered for work details in hospitals and fields. Others joined English language classes organized by the Red Cross. At night, when the generators hummed and the cicadas sang outside, they talked in whispers about what it meant. Was this kindness real? Or was it another trick? A slow punishment meant to break their minds instead of their bodies? But every morning brought proof that it was real. Breakfast, letters delivered through the Red Cross, even movies projected on white sheets, films they'd never imagined watching with their captors. It was confusing. How could an enemy treat them better than their own regime had treated outsiders, and sometimes their own? For the first time since the war began, they had space to think, to remember, to feel something other than fear. One nurse wrote in her journal, "They do not hate us, they pity us. I do not know which hurts more." And that feeling, that clash between guilt and gratitude, would only deepen with what came next, because soon they'd be led to the showers. And for those women, the memory of Europe's camps would collide head-on with America's mercy in a moment they would never forget. Morning came early in Camp Hearn. A whistle blew, echoing across the Texas plains, and the German women stepped into sunlight so sharp it hurt their eyes. For a moment they forgot they were prisoners. Rows of wooden barracks lined the compound like a small town, neat, organized, strangely calm. Guards stood by the gates, rifles slung but relaxed, chatting over coffee. It didn't look like a prison. It looked like order. The women gathered for roll call, names ticked off by an officer who didn't shout. He smiled, even joked about the heat. Back home, military life had meant fear, the bark of a superior, the constant dread of punishment. Here, there was structure without cruelty. Breakfast was served in a long hall. Real bread, butter, hot coffee that smelled like civilization. Some hesitated to eat, afraid it was a test. But when the guards sat down with their own trays, chatting casually, the tension broke. Forks clinked. Someone laughed, quietly, as if remembering how. Outside, the Texas wind hummed through barbed wire. It wasn't freedom, but it was something close. Safety. Days settled into a rhythm. The women were assigned to work details, sewing uniforms, cooking, tending small vegetable gardens that lined the edges of the camp. Others volunteered to help in nearby hospitals, assisting American nurses who, to their shock, treated them not as enemies but as colleagues. One of them, a former Luftwaffe radio operator named Helga, wrote later in her diary, "They asked my opinion about a patient, me the enemy. I didn't know what to say." That single line captured the confusion spreading through the camp. These women had been told America was a land of hatred. Yet here, decency was routine. On Sundays, they were allowed to attend chapel. The chaplain spoke slowly, his words translated by an interpreter. "War ends," he said. "Humanity should not." A few prisoners wept. Others looked away, ashamed. At first, they clung to the beliefs they'd been raised with, that mercy was weakness, that only power commanded respect. But every day, those beliefs cracked a little more. There were small moments that hit harder than speeches. A guard kneeling to tie a prisoner's loose shoelace. A Red Cross volunteer sneaking extra sugar into their tea. A local farmer waving to the women as they rode past in trucks. His children smiling from the fence. No one had smiled at them in years. Evenings brought something no one expected, music. Someone found an accordion. Another built a violin from scrap wood. Soon, the camp mess hall echoed with songs. Not marches, but folk tunes. An American officer listening outside whispered, "They sound homesick." Inside, the women sang softly, voices trembling on old lyrics about rivers, fields, and lost love. In those moments, they weren't soldiers or prisoners, just people trying to remember who they had been before the war. But not everyone accepted the new reality. A few diehard Nazis, still loyal to the Reich, accused others of betraying Germany by cooperating. Whispers spread of informants, of those who'd report anyone who smiled too freely at an American. For them, captivity wasn't liberation, it was humiliation. The camp guards noticed the tension but rarely intervened, letting time and kindness do the work that punishment never could. And time was working. By late summer 1945, the women's faces had changed. sunburnt, healthy, fuller. They moved with confidence again. Some even began learning English. One scrawled phrases on her bunk wall. Please, thank you, good morning. Another whispered to her friend, if my mother saw this, she wouldn't believe me. But the true test of their transformation was still ahead. Because soon, an event that seemed harmless, ordinary even, would open wounds none of them knew they still carried. It would happen in the shower block. And what began as a routine hygiene inspection would turn into an emotional storm that rippled through the entire camp. What happens when mercy meets memory? When the simplest act reminds you of everything you lost. They were about to find out. It began as nothing more than a maintenance order. The guards announced that all prisoners were to report to the hygiene block for inspection. No one thought twice until they saw the tiled room. Rows of pipes ran overhead. The concrete floor sloped toward a drain. Steam hissed softly from behind a metal door. Then came the smell, sharp, clean, unmistakable. So, the chatter died. A heavy silence spread through the line. For many of these women, that smell was not comfort. It was terror. In Europe, rumors had traveled farther than truth. They'd heard what happened to undesirables marched into rooms that looked just like this. Even those who hadn't seen it with their own eyes had heard the whispers, the pipes, the gas, the silence afterward. Now, standing here in an American camp thousands of miles away, every memory rushed back. A guard, noticing their hesitation, frowned. Let's move along, ladies. No shouting, no violence. Just confusion. One woman stepped forward, trembling. Wasser? She asked in broken English. Water. The sergeant nodded. Yes, hot water. Go ahead. The first droplets hit the floor. Steam rose. The hiss became a roar. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then a cry rang out, not of fear, but relief. Warm water. Real, clean, blessed water. Some broke down, sobbing openly. Others laughed through tears, washing away months of grime and disbelief. A Red Cross nurse, watching from the doorway, later wrote, it was as if they were being reborn. In that shower block, the war briefly disappeared. The women scrubbed until their skin burned, until the gray stains of Europe, mud, soot, and guilt, swirled down the drain. When they stepped out, wrapped in clean towels, their faces were flushed, their eyes bright. But inside, something deeper was happening. For the first time, they weren't reacting to propaganda or orders. They were confronting the lie they'd lived under, that compassion was weakness, that enemies could never be human. Later that night, as the camp quieted, Helga, the former radio operator, sat on her bunk, clutching the bar of soap she'd saved. It smells like mercy, she whispered. Her bunkmate didn't answer. She just nodded and turned away so no one would see her cry. Word of the shower incident spread through the camp within hours. Every prisoner had her own version of it. Some swore they'd felt angels in that steam. Others called it the moment they stopped being afraid. For the guards, it was nothing remarkable, just a routine wash. But for the prisoners, it was a pivot point between two worlds. The one they'd left, and the one they were learning to believe in. That night, laughter drifted through the barracks, soft, uncertain, like a song remembered from childhood. A guard walking the perimeter stopped to listen. They're laughing, he murmured. That's new. What the Americans didn't know was that laughter could be more dangerous to an empire built on fear than any weapon. And soon, that laughter would start crossing borders, through letters, through whispers, through every story these women would tell when they finally went home. Because if a simple shower could erase years of hate, what else might mercy undo? That was the question Nazi officials feared most. While the women of Camp Herne were rediscovering dignity, another kind of war was unraveling 5,000 miles away. A war of words. In the final months of the Reich, German radios still blared the same message day and night. Americans are savages. Surrender means slavery or death. It was a simple formula. Fear was control. And fear, for years, had worked perfectly. But now, for the first time, that fear was cracking. Letters began to slip through the Red Cross channels. Censored, inspected, but still carrying fragments of forbidden truth. We have food. They treat us fairly. We work, but we are not beaten. Each letter that reached Germany was a quiet explosion. Families gathered around them in disbelief. Could the enemy really be humane? Could kindness exist on the other side of propaganda? In Berlin, officials panicked. They banned POW correspondence from being read aloud in public. Any hint that the Americans were showing decency was labeled defeatism. But the truth had already begun to spread, in whispers, in kitchens, in the flicker of doubt behind once loyal eyes. Meanwhile, inside the American camps, the transformation of the prisoners deepened. The women who had arrived fearful and rigid now moved with purpose. Some organized classes in English and arithmetic. Others painted, wrote poems, or joined choirs. Helga, the radio operator, was assigned to a hospital detail. She bandaged American soldiers without hesitation. One of them, a young Texan named Michael, thanked her with a quiet smile. "No one ever said thank you before," she admitted. It was small moments like that, honest, ordinary, that eroded years of indoctrination faster than any speech could. Still, not everyone in America was comfortable with such compassion. Local newspapers ran headlines questioning why prisoners of war were eating better than some U.S. citizens still on rations. "Why are we feeding the enemy?" one editor demanded. For families who had lost sons in Europe, kindness felt like betrayal. The military command held firm. "We're not feeding them," one officer said. "We're feeding the idea that we're better than what we fight." And that statement, that belief, would become one of the quiet victories of the war. The irony wasn't lost on the prisoners. They had been told America was barbaric, yet they found structure, fairness, even decency. They had been told they were fighting for civilization, yet their homeland had turned to ruin and murder. The contrast gnawed at them. At night, the camp's small library stayed lit. Prisoners borrowed English books, Mark Twain, Dickens, Whitman. Some underlined phrases, struggling to translate words like freedom, truth, justice. Words that now meant something entirely different. But outside the camp, other prisoners, especially the diehards, wrote secret letters of their own. They called their more open-minded comrades traitors, weak, brainwashed by American lies. It was a battle of ideology fought not with guns, but with ideas. And America was winning not through propaganda but through proof. Through decency visible to anyone willing to see. By autumn 1945, more than 400,000 German POWs were scattered across the United States. Most would return home changed, some quietly grateful, others too ashamed to admit that the enemy had treated them as equals. A few would stay, marrying Americans after the war, building lives far from the rubble they once served. For the women in Texas, the transformation was personal and irreversible. Helga's diary for that month contained one line that captured the shift better than any statistic. "They taught me that strength isn't cruelty, it's restraint." But even as the truth of that lesson settled in, another chapter was waiting, the end of the war and the return home. Would Germany accept what they had become? Or would they carry their shame and gratitude like invisible scars into a country that no longer recognized them? The war ended with silence. No sirens. No speeches, just the slow realization that the world they'd known was gone. In Camp Herne, the guards read the announcement from a radio. "Germany has surrendered." The women stared at the dusty ground. Some smiled through tears. Others turned away, hollow-eyed. The Reich that had promised them glory had vanished. And with it, the certainty that had defined their lives. But there was no celebration, only waiting. Months passed as repatriation lists were drawn up. One by one, the prisoners packed their meager belongings. Letters, handmade trinkets, and, for many, that same bar of soap they'd been given on arrival. It had become a symbol of disbelief, of mercy, of survival. When the ships finally carried them home across the Atlantic, the women watched America disappear on the horizon. Helga wrote in her final diary entry from the deck, "I came here a soldier. I leave a witness." But what waited in Germany was not the homecoming they expected. Their towns were rubble, their families scattered, and the people who had stayed behind looked at returning POWs with suspicion. especially those who spoke too fondly of life in American camps. "You sound like one of them," one neighbor hissed. For the women, silence became survival. They locked away their memories of Texas. The kindness, the music, the showers, because no one wanted to hear them. The country was mourning. Admitting that the enemy had shown humanity was unthinkable. Yet those memories refused to die. Decades later, when journalists and historians tracked down surviving POWs, they spoke softly, sometimes with tears, sometimes with awe. One woman remembered the first time she saw a guard share his canteen during a work detail. "He didn't see a German," she said. "He saw a thirsty person." Another recalled being called Fräulein instead of prisoner. "That word made me feel human again," she whispered. It was a small kindness, but in war, small kindnesses are miracles. As the years passed, the story of the American POW camps faded into the background of history. It didn't fit the usual narrative of victory and vengeance. But in libraries and archives, letters and photographs still told the quieter story. One where compassion was a weapon more powerful than hate. Helga's own life after the war was quiet. She became a teacher. She never married, but every year, on the anniversary of her capture, she lit a candle and placed a small bar of soap beside it. Her students never knew what it meant. But in her final letter, discovered after her death, she wrote, "They taught me that the war didn't end when the guns stopped. It ended when someone chose to be kind." That's the legacy history often forgets, that decency, extended even to an enemy, can rewrite a person's soul. Because war is not only fought with bullets and flags. It's fought in the human heart, where hatred battles mercy, and mercy sometimes wins. The German women who showered with soap in Texas didn't just survive captivity. They carried home a truth the world still struggles to learn. That strength isn't in revenge, but in restraint. And that humanity, even in the enemy's hands, can become the beginning of peace. They arrived as prisoners and left as witnesses. If stories like this remind you that kindness can survive even in the darkest wars, subscribe for more true tales where humanity defied hatred, and history whispered that mercy is mightier than conquest.